Hey pushers, Mr. Imatsu here, coming in with your next activity. I believe this is activity number 6 for period 8. And we're coming in with the Civil Rights Movement Part 2, kind of. Once again, it's kind of interesting. It's kind of hard to, the way Khan Academy kind of creates items, to kind of put this in a perfectly sequential event. So we're kind of going to talk a little bit about the civil rights and then also talk about the presidency of John F. Kennedy and also Lyndon B. Johnson as they do some civil rights stuff, but they also are involved in some foreign policy items too. So again, we're trying to do both at the kind of the same time. So you're going to hear some kind of repeats from last week regarding the Vietnam War. But just to give you an idea, right, we should actually just quickly go through the presidents. I think that might help us a little bit over here. Something I just thought of right now. So let me just go through this real quick so that we can get a better idea. I think this will give you guys a good idea what's going on. So let's go back to, let's go to Woodrow Wilson then. Woodrow Wilson, World War I, right? Treaty of Versailles, 14 points. Then we get the Republican presidents. These Republican presidents ultimately ending with Herbert Hoover are going to have the hands-off approach that kind of leads to this kind of Great Depression. And Franklin Delano Roosevelt comes in with the New Deal and the Great Depression. He goes multiple years. Kind of an interesting fact that we never talked about. If you look at his time span, there's 12 years right there. So he went for 3, try to go on his 4th term of service. And after actually this, after his presidency, Congress will pass an amendment to make sure that you can only serve for 2 terms. All presidents before that just did that out of respect for George Washington and what he did. But FDR, he kept on going. Again, some criticism of FDR is he may have acted more like a dictator, right? Accumulating a lot more power, trying to override the Supreme Court or pack the Supreme Court with people that would be in his New Deal, forcing the New Deal, which is a series of like economic kind of stimulus packages, forcing it through Congress, So it's very interesting, as a historian, to really think critically about Franklin Delano Roosevelt, because you can see why some of the critics thought he was trying to gain and influence way too much power, especially for a president, right? So interesting. Truman, remember that Franklin Delano Roosevelt passes at the very end of World War II-ish, and Truman is the one that will be dropping the 2 bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. We get Eisenhower, then there's Kennedy. Eisenhower was during the Korean War, and he also warned us of our military-industrial complex. And now we're getting into John F. Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And remember, underneath all of this is civil rights and a movement towards environmentalism and other ideas, right? And we'll end this period with Jimmy Carter. So we'll be talking about Nixon as well, and then Jimmy Carter. We're not going to talk too much about Ford. So anyways, just wanted to give you a quick review about that, because again, we are going back and forth, and hopefully those are some of the major events or that happened during each of the presidencies. This guy had the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis under John F. Kennedy. He's also going to increase the Vietnam there, and also he's going to have to deal with Vietnam, and he's going to get us out of Vietnam, Richard Nixon. So just kind of hopefully that kind of gives you a little idea of a timeline. And what we are going to do, actually, our last activity for this period is we're going to do a timeline activity. I think that will really help you guys out. So, all right, so moving on. Let's get into the actual events of this activity rather than an overview, and let's get to the first thing. So massive resistance. As we know, there's this kind of movement through Emmett Till, through Rosa Parks, through court cases like Brown versus Board of Education at now a federal level. And also at a federal level, there's a really huge movement, again, in Washington, D.C. That doesn't necessarily mean the South, right? And that can still be held true today, in my opinion. So up in Washington, D.C., there's this movement towards equality, but the South and the southern states and the people in the southern states are reacting quite violently to this, what they perceive like forced integration. And one of the things that you'll learn about is something called massive resistance. This is done by white supremacists, largely white Southerners, saying that they want to keep segregation, right? Despite the rulings of Brown versus Board of Education that we talked in our previous activity. One of the people that I always think of when I think about George Wallace, is that I think of his famous speech where he said segregation now and segregation forever. So I think he would be a prime example. He's a Alabama governor, I believe. Yeah, so there it is right there. Alabama governor, and he really supports the idea of this segregationist view. And he makes multiple speeches on that floor. He also, I think he stays as a senator. He converts to a senator, and he just recently passed, but was a senator up for a long time for the state of Alabama. still endorsing these rules so real recently. Um, in Arkansas, there's this capital city, Little Rock, and Little Rock, or not capital city, but I just know that Bill Clinton came from Little Rock, so I always remember that. But anyways, there's 9 individuals, African Americans, who went to a high school, um, and you're going to learn about them. But obviously, using the Brown versus Board of Education case, they felt that they should be able to be integrated into it. And so these 9 individuals actually go through an integration. And the experience is quite horrifying, for especially the Little Rock 9. At first, they first show up on the first day, and there's actually state troops by the governor to block them from coming. And as they try to go in, you're going to hear the accounts of one of these ladies, like one of the guards puts a bayonet towards her, like she's going to get stabbed and killed if she tries to go to school. So she backs off, and when she gets backed off, she meets, and this is actually kind of that day, a bunch of hostilities from white individuals who are screaming and doing multiple things that you're going to hear, but very, very horrible, vicious things to her. And so after a few, I don't know if it's weeks or months, but after a few days later, let's say, basically the federal troops from Washington, D.C., by the order of the president, actually come down, and they actually remove the state troops, or he actually federalizes them. So now he has to listen to the president, and basically brings these African American individuals in under armed guard. So this time, now they have the National Guard, theoretically, or the federalized troops, the federal troops kind of supporting them and helping them get in, rather than having the state troops go against. Again, you're seeing the state versus federal power, right? The same thing that happened in the Civil War, right? Is this idea, and the same thing that can be said about Thomas Jefferson. The idea of state rights should be more precedent to the federal rights. And this is that kind of balance that you're seeing here now at a micro level regarding education. So the first couple of days, first day they're met with armed guards that'll stab them. The next, a few days later, there's armed troops that are escorting them under the safety through the crowd to make sure that they can go to school and not be harmed or hurt. And so this is another step towards the reintegration. And you're going to learn about the reaction of these individuals, of these high school students that had how they reacted as students who are white there. After Eisenhower comes JFK. We kind of talked about that. JFK is really known as a very charismatic individual, known as a very popular president. Historians have always, or a lot of my professors in college always question, like, what exactly did he accomplish, at certain levels, which is quite an interesting criticism of him. And say, like, the image of JFK, the aura of JFK is oftentimes a little bit more embellished than what his actual policy actions were. So kind of an interesting way to do it. We're going to review just a couple of the items. If you remember, the Cold War is happening at this time in Cuba, and Fidel Castro have taken it over. So he launches an invasion to the Bay of Pigs, which fails miserably. So I just wanted to remind you about that. You're going to get a little reminder of that. This is also, he is the president that has the Cuban Missile Crisis. Remember when there were some missiles perhaps going into Cuba? They're building a missile launch site, and he negotiates it, and Russia turns theoretically the ships with missiles back to Russia. So Cuba doesn't have any nuclear arms, and there's kind of deals that are made. He's also going to be the president that increases our involvement in the Vietnam War. After the French are kind of getting their butt kicked here in the South Vietnam, he comes in and he starts bringing in what he calls advisors. It's not a state of war. He hasn't declared war, but he is the kind of first president that's really starting to push a lot more troops into South Vietnam and kind of start getting us into the sticky situation towards Vietnam. So, that kind of talks about his foreign policy. There's a lot of economic things that he does. One thing that he does is he begins increasing spending. That means increases the size of government. That means creating government programs, because at this time he comes into a recession. And so he thinks, using John Maynard Keynes, that the government should help with, providing people money, like what we're doing right now, like stimulus checks. So he's not doing exactly stimulus checks, but he has that mentality that the government should be involved as a Democrat, that it should be doing things to help its people, even if that means causing us to go in debt, because later we'll go ahead and raise taxes in wealthier times and remove that debt. That's kind of the idea of Keynesian economics. And right now we are taking that to a whole new level as our debt load just increases time over time. But, Keynes would say that's important to do right now because, people are out of work, people are out of jobs, and we need to do things to stimulate the economy. After JFK comes his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson assumes presidency after the assassination of John F. Kennedy. You can see that right here. He actually did it up in like Air Force Two, I believe they call it. And so that's, he assumes that presidency and he gets reelected. And his focus really was domestic. He really wanted to focus on something he called the war on poverty. He wanted to expand ideas of the New Deal. He wanted to be seen as kind of like FDR New Deal Part 2. He wanted to expand ideas of unemployment, expand ideas of Social Security and disability, and housing and education. Like that was his goal, was a war on poverty. What's interesting about him is he's kind of stuck with this Vietnam issue. And I remember, this is kind of a good picture of him right there. I remember reading, that he'd kind of scream out, especially to his advisors, "God damn this war," and I apologize to curse a little bit, but he would say that out loud because the war was diverting American public attention towards the war rather than focus on his policies that he wanted to back at home. And, there's just multiple issues where he is a president because of JFK that's going to increase the presence of America in there. And that during that time, that the American experience is just not getting better, right? It's getting worse in Vietnam. So one of those experiences that he gets is the Gulf of Tonkin resolution. If you guys remember, it happened over here, and it kind of gave him more unlimited powers to go into the war, in which he does, and he sends even more troops and gets us more involved. And again, just to remind you, this is exactly what he wanted to be remembered for, but he always felt like the Vietnam War distracted the American public and distracted him and his government from actually accomplishing more that he wanted to on the war on poverty. And that was his policy. That was his idea. That was his program, was the war on poverty. So that's something I want to do. He was successful. You're going to learn about that, right? He created a Head Start program, which helps people with pre-K. He does some very important things, but I think he felt that his legacy and his presidency would be tarnished by the war rather than appreciated for the war on poverty. So, and then when I say the war, the Vietnam War, right? He had to keep on getting more and more involved. So, all right, guys. So there's this one, and I apologize for the kind of haphazard, a little bit confusing nature of this. Hopefully you're getting bits and pieces. And then when we do this timeline activity, you can see the events move perfectly in time so that you can go back and forth, right? If you didn't know what the Vietnam War was, you didn't know Lyndon B. Johnson, and you see a timeline, be even more confusing in my opinion. So if you're slightly confused, not that big of a deal, but hopefully you understand the idea of massive resistance, integration, and some of the policy events, and kind of lining up those times with JFK that we've already discussed in the Cold War and Lyndon B. Johnson. And we're getting there. All right, guys, take care. See you in the next one.